There has been a series of tremendous economic dislocations over the past few years. Whole industries have been wiped out. Whole towns have been disfigured. Many thousand people have lost their livelihood. Last week we discussed some of the micro causes of this in terms of the world, the trade policies that the United States has been pursuing since the Wilson administration, and the human cost of those policies. This week we'd like to focus on the bigger picture, which is the New World Order. Without free trade, unrestricted trade, there can be no New World Order. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. Joining me today are the Reverend Fathers William Jenkins. Father William Jenkins is editor and publisher of the Roman Catholic and pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church. Father Clarence Kelly, superior of the Society of St. Pius V from Oyster Bay Cove, New York. And Mr. William Gill, author, publisher, historian, author of Trade Wars Against America. Mr. Gill, last week we were discussing some of these issues. One issue we didn't quite get into, we could just touch on before we get into the Wilson administration's role in the New World Order, is this idea of American industries not competing against foreign industries, but foreign governments. How can anyone compete against a government?
Well, it's impossible for privately owned American industry to compete against the unlimited, virtually unlimited resources of the treasuries of Japan or Britain or whoever it is that we may be trying to compete against. They can just keep pouring the money in, you see, in order to enable the dumping of their products into our markets, which they have been doing. The treasuries, in other words, our industries, our workers have been competing against the governments of the socialized world, because almost all the rest of the world is socialized. The steel industry in the world outside the United States is about 90% government-owned, the steel industries. There has been some privatization in recent years, but it's really insignificant as compared to the total picture. The result of that is that America has lost literally millions of its highest-paying, best jobs. It's wiped out our communities, as you noted.
Farmers.
Well, the commerce, obviously. But I want to go deeper than that, because this is a moral question. I maintain that the trade policy of the United States in keeping our markets wide open while others restrict us from going in, that this is not just immoral, it's criminal. It is criminal to take a man's livelihood away from him and ship it to Mexico or to China or to any other country for that matter. American workers should not be forced to compete with the coolie labor of the Chinese, where it's really all slave labor. It's still a communist state. And it isn't just the slave labor camps and the army-owned factories that our workers should not, but all of the Chinese, those over 1 billion people who are now shipping, you know, something like 60% of all the toys that we're going to buy at Christmas time in this country come from China, from communist China. And yet this is a Christian holiday that we're supposed to be celebrating the birth of Christ.
When you think about it, you're talking about not just a socialist state, you're talking about a state that is run by murderers and gangsters. You know, when they had those those demonstrations
Tiananmen Square.
in Tiananmen Square, you know what their final solution was? Their final solution was to go in and murder them and then to pile up their bodies with bulldozers and set them on fire. And yet the American government falls over itself to promote the interests of this group of gangsters that runs that country and brutalizes those people. So I think we're not only selling our own people short, and it is a moral question, and I think it is criminal. We're not only selling our own people short, but we are actually supporting those gangsters that make the mafia look like choir boys. In comparison with what the mafia does with all of their drugs and murders, it's nothing in comparison with those gangsters in Peking are doing, and they are in power. They have the same system. This is the same gang that during Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution practiced cannibalism. This was Communist Party policy, that you could demonstrate your loyalty to the party by murdering and eating people. These are the same people, the same clique, the same gang. And now not only are they imposing so much on their own people, but because of the cooperation of our government, our people are suffering too.
Mr. Gill, before we get into the Wilson administration, let me just fast forward just a few years when the NAFTA debate was featured between Vice President Gore and Mr. Perot. The famous red herring was tossed out at Mr. Perot. Oh, you're for tariffs. Look what Smoot-Hawley did in the 1930s. It brought about the Depression. It sent the whole world into a depression. We can't have that. Do you buy that argument?
No, and I wished when I saw that debate, incidentally, that I had been sitting there and not Mr. Perot, because I would have rammed that right down Vice President Gore's throat. The Smoot-Hawley, which is just one of the many myths that's been created by the free traders, actually was not enacted until after the crash of 1929, so it had nothing to do with the thing that triggered the Depression. But more than that, and I cite this in my book, the late Senator John Hines of Pennsylvania put this in the congressional record not too long before he was killed in that plane crash a few years ago. An excellent study that proved that only an infinitesimal part of the total trade of the United States, let alone of the world, was affected by Smoot-Hawley. Right. It had nothing to do with it, and yet I have heard the Prime Minister of Japan come to the National Press Club in Washington and blame not only the Depression of the 1930s, but World War II on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Well, obviously he forgot that they bombed us at Pearl Harbor, but what they've been doing for 40 years with the encouragement of our government is bombing us economically, taking out the factories. 700 steel mills closed in the United States within a 12-year period in the 1970s through 1987. 700 steel mills. I didn't know we had that many, but we did.
Mr. Gill, you mentioned in your book, Trade Wars Against America, that really the watershed event was the 1912 election of President Wilson, who reversed our traditional trade policies, and two very significant other things happened: the imposition of the income tax and the Federal Reserve System, which is actually a private corporation which controls our economic livelihood.
Well, I maintain in the book that 1913 was the year of the Second American Revolution, the secret revolution that the American people have never been told about, and which I must confess that I didn't know about until I started to do the research for this book some years ago. And there were four things that happened in that year. And the very first thing was that President Wilson called a special session of the Congress to do away with the traditional American protective system that had been instituted by the Founding Fathers in the very first legislation passed by the first Congress of the United States, signed into law by George Washington on July the 4th, 1789, was the Trade and Revenue Act. Why? Because the tariffs provided the bulk of the revenue, 98% in the beginning. And right down to this year that I'm talking about, 1913, it was still between 40 and 50% of the revenue for running the government. So they destroyed the tariff system. They dismantled the tariff, destroyed the protective system. They couldn't have done this, but they had the income tax coming in on a congressional amendment track that emerged from a previous debate on a previous Trade Act a few years before. And so the income tax took up where the tariff left off. It replaced the tariff. The third thing was another constitutional amendment that the progressives, so-called, they were Marxist in many cases, came in, was the election of senators by the state legislatures, which the founding fathers had rightly insisted that at least one branch be kept away from the popular vote, because you had the House elected by the people, but the other was elected by, the Senate was elected by, and they did away with that and turned over the election of senators to the masses. And then finally was the creation of the Federal Reserve Act. And the same people were involved in all of this. And the mastermind of the whole thing is a little man that I call the revolutionary in a top hat, Edward Mandell House, who was the real president of the United States, incidentally. Mm-hmm. He engineered these things, and he brought back into being, at the very end of that year, some of the senators had already gone home for their Christmas vacation, and they snuck this thing through in the floor of the Senate and created the Federal Reserve System, which is a private system, incidentally. It's not a government system at all. It's owned, the shareholders are the big banks. And this created this tremendous credit, which enabled them to give the loans to Europe that extended World War I, that kept World War I going, and inevitably got us in to rescue these loans, you see. Mm-hmm. That was the primary reason. And the Federal Reserve was responsible also for the terrible depression that came after World War I. It was responsible for the crash of 1929 when it tightened up on the credit in that year.
Remarkably.
Wow. And it's been responsible for a good bit of the other mischief ever since. And it is my contention, my firm belief, that the American people have had really nothing substantively to say about their government since that revolution of 1913, since the Federal Reserve put the cap on the well of the gusher, if you will, that began with the dismantlement of the tariff and the protective system.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're talking about free trade. Father Kelly.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Mr. Miguel, with regard to this, tying it all together, because a lot of people are confused about a lot of things, and especially about the events that are unfolding before their eyes. It's very difficult for people to see the big picture. They see just this is happening and that is happening, and they think these are isolated events that are just unfolding before their eyes. If we had a revolution in 1913, it was a revolt against something they were trying to change, and they had some goal in mind. How would you describe, what is it that they were revolting against, and what is it that they were trying to establish, which is still the ultimate object of the things we are seeing this very day in these trade agreements?
They were revolting against what they called the trusts, which were the big conglomerates of that day, which incidentally were minuscule compared to the conglomerates that we now, the multinational corporations that we now have. But that was the rationale, that the progressives were revolting against the trusts, as they called them. What the goal was, and Wilson announced this, was the creation of a new world order. That's what he called it. Exactly the same thing that George Bush has called it, and that Clinton has at least implicitly called it. And Wilson was not just fanatically dedicated to this, but insanely dedicated to it. There's a very serious question. We know that he had this total mental collapse, you know, and the government was run by his wife for the last year and a half, 2 years of his second administration. She appointed the cabinet office and so on. So this is what they were out to do. Now, just recently, and I revealed this in one of our newsletters this past summer in the context of the NAFTA battle that was going on in the Congress, We've been warning people for some time through our newsletters that free trade was creating the New World Order, and that NAFTA was going to be a big, giant step toward the creation of the New World Order. But I'm not sure that they really believed us until Henry Kissinger came out and confessed it. And here is what he said. NAFTA will, quote, represent the most creative step toward a new world order taken by any group of nations since the end of the Cold War, and the first step toward the even larger vision of a free trade zone for the entire Western Hemisphere. We're going to be merged economically, but more than economically, because you do it economically and you also do it politically,
Right.
with all the rest of Latin America. We're going to see our standard of living go down to the same standard of living that exists in Brazil and Colombia and the rest of these places, and it will happen, I confidently predict, in no more than 20 years, 30 at the most. Why do I predict that? Because just recently, a professor at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas said in a book called The Myth of Free Trade, Professor Batra, that he charted the year that I have in my book, 1972, when the first trade deficit popped up in this century in the Nixon administration. And ever since then, we've had these tremendous trade deficits, up to $200 billion a year through the, in the 1980s, and still well over $100 billion a year. And in that time, he tracked it, and from that point on, there has been a steady, uninterrupted decline in the standard of living in this country. This is why we have so many working mothers, because families can no longer support themselves with just the wages of the father.
That's true.
The mother has to go out to work too, and they're now something like 60 or 70% of all the mothers, married mothers in this country, are working today.
You know, Father Jenkins, you once referred to a book which envisioned, it was written by a Catholic, a convert to Catholicism, Monsignor Hugh Ross Benson, which envisioned the latter days about this New World Society. And just to make a remark about this New World Order, David Rockefeller, who was a tremendous proponent of free trade and NAFTA, said everything is in place after 500 years to build a true new world in the Western Hemisphere. And he added, I don't think that criminal would be too strong a word to describe rejecting NAFTA. How does Monsignor...
Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson,
right,
in his book, The Lord of the World, foresaw the dropping of trade barriers as a prelude to the coming of the Antichrist, which, if one calculates from various signals he gives in his book, he envisions as happening somewhere in the end of the first quarter of the next century, about the year 2025. Of course, the process of socialization and one-worldization, or what they now call, I guess, globalization, was taking place for a couple of generations before that in his book. So his book was quite prophetic in that regard. But, of course, the whole idea is to try to make every nation simply a state in a larger one-world nation governed by a single world power, a world government. And the step to do that, the most striking step, or the most effective step, is to make the economy of the world a one-world economy. It's all based on Marx's idea that man is essentially an economic animal, no soul, nothing supernatural, no eternal life, but that he lives for his stomach. It is taking the statement of St. Paul to its ultimate conclusion that their gods are their stomachs. This is exactly how Marxists and socialists look at the human race, and this is what they're working toward, this is what they're counting on as they push forward to this global economy.
Father Kelly, how would, you know, there's numerous ways of looking at these events. One can look at it as an economist or a historian. How would one look at what's unfolding before our very eyes through the eyes of the Church? How would the Church look at
Well,
this?
I essentially look at it as a Catholic priest and as a citizen of America, because according to Catholic teaching, we are as under great an obligation to love our country as we ought to love our mother and our father. In fact, it comes under the same virtue of piety. The supreme obligation we have is to God, and we express that obligation by the virtue of religion. After God comes our family and our country, and this is Catholic teaching, and that means we owe to our mother and our father and to our country a certain reverence and respect and proper service. So from a Catholic point of view, from a moral point of view, we have a duty to protect our country. And what is really behind this, as I see it, is not simply the creation of a world economy for some economic reason exclusively, but rather the creation of an international government. Yes. Because you will have to have an international army, as the New York Times has called for consistently over the last year and a half or two. You will have to have an international court. You will have to have an international legislative body. These international organizations, under the direction of the New World Order and probably the United Nations, represent a threat to our national sovereignty. So in other words, the United States has engaged in certain wars in the past, ostensibly to protect the sovereignty of this country. In other words, if someone shows up at our door with a gun in their hand and they say, we're going to take over your country, we are ready to fight and to die. And what they are doing now is they are doing it in a different way. They are threatening the sovereignty of the United States ostensibly through this free trade flag, with the ultimate goal of establishing an international government that would deprive the United States of its sovereignty. And we as Americans, and certainly as Catholics, are duty-bound to oppose these enemies, whether they are enemies without or enemies within. That is the moral teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to this question.
Now, Father Kelly, you point out that the current administrations leading up to it, were pushing for the creation of a one-world army, of an international army, but Vatican II called for that. You know, in one of the documents of Vatican II, it explicitly called for the establishment of an international police force, which would be supplied by the men and materials provided by the various nations, right, and that individual nations maintain nothing more than a force large enough to maintain domestic peace. This was, oddly enough, also the gist of a proposal submitted by John F. Kennedy to the United Nations as well, about the very same time. The wording is so perfectly similar.
It was written by Walt Rostow.
It's hard to believe it was an accident.
Not Vatican II,
the
but
Kennedy proposal.
Kennedy proposal. But incidentally, what you have just said, both of you, but you particularly, Father Kelly, about the creation of the New World Order, this is the central theme, really. I think you can testify to this, can't you, Julius? And we have a president quoted in the Carta that you may want to give the short quote from, which shows what his goal, not just his goal, but the goal of every other president since Roosevelt, at least, and going back to Wilson, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. President Carter was a free trader, a New Worlder. Right. He said this, in a Voyager spacecraft, he put this message. He said, the Voyager spacecraft was constructed by the United States of America. We are a community of 240 million human beings among the more than 4 billion human beings who inhabit the planet Earth. We human beings are still divided into nation states, but these states are rapidly becoming a single global civilization. We hope someday, having solved the problems we face, to join a community of galactic civilizations. This is the former president of the United States.
Not too many years ago.
Father Kelly, how would...
The victim is national sovereignty.
That's right.
This is a sovereign nation. We as Americans and as Catholics are loyal to America. We are not loyal to the United Nations. We are not loyal to Europe. We are not loyal to other foreign governments. We have to respect other people and treat them in a decent Christian fashion. But our loyalty is to the United States. And St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, he really summed it up in this whole question, believe it or not, of national sovereignty and free trade writing in the 13th century. Here's what he said. He said, "The higher a thing is in the scale of being, the more fully self-sufficient it is, since whatever needs another's help is by that very fact shown to be defective. But the state is more fully self-sufficing, which is supplied with all that it needs from its own territory, that state is, than the one which must obtain its supplies from abroad." And then he went on to say, accordingly, "It is better that a state should be supplied with food and whatever it needs from its own territory than that it should be completely dependent on trade." So it is necessary for the United States to be independent in order to preserve and protect our national sovereignty.
The GATT Global Trade Treaty, which will come into being if the Congress approves it, as they did the NAFTA, is going to wipe out, totally wipe out, the farmers in France and Germany and the rest of Europe, and to a large extent even what's left of the family farms in our own country, I must add. It will destroy the ancient civilizations of Western Europe, which is the heartland of not just Catholicism, but all of Christianity as we know it. And that's going to, I mean, these churches will not be supported anymore in the local communities of France and Germany.
Mr. Gill, we're out of time. I'm sorry we have to go. Please, we'd like